Welcome back to Biblical Reflections. Tonight we're going to conclude the story of the binding of Isaac. We'll do what I call the sixth dimension or the Chassidic dimension of the binding of Isaac. And then we're going to take a break through the Passover holiday. We'll come back a week after Passover and to do our spring semester of Biblical Reflections, finding yourselves in the stories of the book of Genesis. After Passover, we're going to focus on two stories of the latter part of the book of Genesis. One story is regarding Isaac and his desire to give blessings. He wanted to give a blessing to Esau. He ends up giving it to Jacob, which causes a great rivalry. And the second story we're going to focus on is perhaps the most famous story of the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph and his brothers. So we have a lot to do in the spring, but for now, let's focus on the conclusion of the binding of Isaac. There is a story told by the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was the founder of the Chabad movement. And he tells a story that he once overheard three oven stokers. What's an oven stoker? Oven stokers was a nickname that was given to the Chassidim of the Maggid of Mezrich. Maggid of Mezrich was the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Chassidic movement. The Maggid had a yeshiva, and in his yeshiva, only prize students made their way into the Maggid's class. The rest had jobs around the yeshiva. They also spent a great deal amount of time studying, but they weren't considered the elite students. And so the Alter Rebbe once overheard three of the non-elite students having a conversation. And he so enjoyed it, he so appreciated hearing these three students have this discussion that in a public address some years later, he repeated the story and it became published and passed on till this very day. So one of these three students says to the others, I don't understand what was so great about the binding of Isaac, about that test. If God would ask me to do the exact same thing, I would do it. If God came to me personally and asked me to do something for him, I would do it. I know it would be difficult, but I would do it. And we make such a big deal about Abraham, I would do it too. But he answered his own question. He said, but here's the difference between me and Abraham. If God were to ask me to sacrifice my only son, I would delay it for a few days so I can spend some time with him, say goodbye to him. The greatness of Abraham was that he woke up early in the morning to fulfill God's command. That I wouldn't have been able to do. So the second oven stoker in the story, the second student says, if God would have asked me to sacrifice my only son, I would have done it. And I wouldn't delay it like you said. I would do it right away, just like Abraham. The difference is I would do it with a heavy heart. Abraham's greatness is that he went to the Akedah, he went to the mountain filled with joy for the opportunity to fulfill God's command. He had enthusiasm that God asked him to do something for him. I wouldn't have been able to do that. The third student says, I also, if God would come to me and speak to me, I would have done it. And I wouldn't have delayed it at all. And I would have had the enthusiasm. But Abraham's uniqueness is how he reacted when he found out that it was all a test. When God, through the angel, commands him not to touch the child, you would expect him to breathe this sigh of relief, like that. No, instead, his focus is that he's so overjoyed because now he was given yet another commandment of God, a new commandment of God. Don't bring any harm to the child. So his focus is not that Isaac was going to live, but wow, I'm so lucky I have another commandment to fulfill. That was the conversation that these three students were having, that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, overheard. And he so enjoyed it. He appreciated hearing their debates and their discussions and what would have been had God asked me. In a talk on the subject of the binding of Isaac, the Lubavitcher Rebbe addresses this same question about the uniqueness of the binding of Isaac. And the Rebbe asks this question: have not countless thousands of Jews gave their lives over history rather than renounce their faith? Now, although some may answer that the willingness to sacrifice a child is a far greater demonstration of faith than to sacrifice yourself, nevertheless, this too we have found throughout the generations. Most notably found in the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, connected to the story of Hanukkah. Here was a mother of 7 children who were being forced by the wicked Antiochus to bow to an idol. And she encourages her children not to give in. And she loses 7 of her children that day, and eventually jumps from a balcony after 7 of her children are tortured and put to death. And before she jumps from the balcony, taking her life, she yells out this statement. She said, "My children, go to Abraham your father, find Abraham in heaven, and say to him this: you bound one offering upon the altar. I have bound 7 offerings. You were asked to do 1, and you got to take him off the altar. I did 7, and I didn't get to take them off the altar." So the Rebbe says, why do we make such a big deal about Abraham when we repeat his story every day? Why not tell the story about Hannah? Is that not even a far greater story? Furthermore, asks the Rebbe, while Abraham was prepared to sacrifice his son, and obviously there's greatness to that, in thousands of such stories throughout our history, Jews actually gave up their lives, and at times the lives of their entire families. It wasn't just a test. They actually had to go through it. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, unlike Abraham, God never spoke to them personally to request their sacrifice. By Abraham, God himself comes to Abraham and says, this is what I want you to do. So a man of absolute faith that has a conversation with God puts aside his own emotions, puts aside his own intellect, follows through on that which God asks him to do because God spoke to him. But throughout history, Jews have given their lives without God coming and saying a word to them. Their courageous acts were simply based on pure amunah, pure faith, even though God was invisible to them. And in many instances, their mesirat nefesh, their self-sacrifice, was not even over a cardinal principle of Judaism, yet they showed this self-sacrifice, this willingness to give up their lives for the sake of God, for the sake of Judaism, for the sake of Torah. So why is it that we recite the story of the binding of Isaac every single day in our prayers? And we base our prayers with the following statement: just like Abraham fulfilled your will with a complete heart, so we ask you to show us your mercy and dispel any anger that you may have towards us, we say to God. When he was clearly not the only one that demonstrated the strength of self-sacrifice, or even the sacrifice of members of the family. There's a commentary on the book of Genesis named the Abar Benel, and he writes that the binding of Isaac must be forever on our lips. For in it, he says, lies the entire strength of the Jewish people and their merit before the Heavenly Father. He makes it the fundamental story of faith. And it all lies, our entire strength of the Jewish people lies on this story. And again, the Rebbe asks this question: why only the binding of Isaac? What about the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, the millions who lost their lives in the Shoah and the Holocaust? The ultimate sacrifice of dying and sanctifying God's name. Furthermore, another question that the Rebbe asks: Why weren't the tests that Abraham passed before Lech Lecha, before God appears to him, before God reveals himself to Abraham, why weren't they considered greater than the ones after God revealed himself to them? For example, in the city of Ur-Kasdim, he stands up to the emperor Nimrod, and he's willing to sacrifice his life for a God whom he never heard from, who he had never spoken to, he's never seen any direct signs from. Is that not a greater sign of loyalty that he's willing to give up his life for a God that he just has a faith in that never spoke to him? Those were the questions that the Rebbe asked. And now to some of the answers. And it begins with a parable. Once there was a vast wilderness. There were no paths in this wilderness, in this forest. There were no trails. There were no maps. There was no information about the terrain. You couldn't go on Google Maps and study it. Along came a man who pioneered the wilderness, and he cut a path through its entire length. Many have followed his footsteps since, and it's still a difficult journey, but now they had a path to follow. They have a map to read. They have a guide how to get through the wilderness. Over the years, there were some who made the journey in more difficult conditions than the original pioneer. Perhaps the weather affected their journey. Perhaps they traveled by night, making it more difficult to see the path. Nevertheless, anyone that sets out to go through this wilderness, to go through this forest, are forever indebted to the pioneer of the path, without whose efforts they wouldn't have ever attempted the journey in the first place. Perhaps you understand what the parable is saying. Abraham was the pioneer of Mesirat Nefesh. He was the pioneer of self-sacrifice. He was the pioneer of willing to give it all up for God. All who have followed on this path, even those whose conditions were far more difficult, as was the case in the story of Hannah and her 7 sons, they all received their ability. They've gotten their capacity, their strength, their determination, their conviction from Grandpa Abraham. It all came from him. In effect, it is Abraham's Mesirat Nefesh, it is his self-sacrifice that is repeated throughout history, because he instilled within each and every single one of his descendants this strength. We can only do it because he went through it. Second, the binding of Isaac was uniquely different than the challenge of anything that came before or any other acts of self-sacrifice of Abraham or the many throughout history. Because as we explained last week, in the 5 dimensions, and if you missed last week, you can see a copy of it on our YouTube channel, last week's class where we focused on the 5 dimensions of the binding of Isaac. Abraham was not just asked by God for the sacrifice of life. He was asked by God for the sacrifice of self. It's different to give up one's life for a cause you believe in. Many have done so, even people from other faiths have done so. If you truly believe in a cause, you give everything for it. Whether because you believe that life without your cause is not worth living, or you perhaps in some other faiths have this expectation of greater reward in the world to come. If I give my life here, I'm going to have a far more heavenly place, a higher heavenly abode. Or because the cause has become your very identity without which you cannot survive. You can't live without it. In all of these cases, one is sacrificing their physical life for the sake of self. Because I need to do this. That was not the case with Abraham and the binding of Isaac. For in the Akedah demanded the very sacrifice of self. As we explained last week, It went against everything that Abraham believed. It was not a cause he believed in. He believed in life. He loved his son. He believed in the mission. He believed in the importance of there being a nation committed to seeing to it that the world was filled with morals and ethics and kindness and caring and love. And all of that would come to an end. Everything he preached, everything he taught, everything he lived for. So then why did he do it? For one reason, and one reason only. God asked. In all other stories, we have some type of logic behind the desire, some type of logic behind the willingness, some type of logic behind the courage. With Abraham, there was no logic at all. And that's the meaning of God's words to Abraham after the binding of Isaac. God says to him, "For now I know that you are one that fears God. Ata yodaiti, now I know." And the obvious question is, now you know that Abraham is a God-fearing man? Now? And all these years before you didn't know it? And the answer is now. Now you have reached that peak, the culmination of the highest form of self-sacrifice, the truest sacrifice of self. Now you have shown that all the tests that you have passed prior to the binding of Isaac was truly due to your connection to God. Now you have demonstrated for all of future history the level of true devotion, of true faith that man can achieve in their service of God. Let's get to purpose now. What was the reason for all of this? I understand the demonstration of faith. I understand the now God knows. I understand that. But what ultimately was the purpose? Many have asked the obvious question about tests in general and the binding of Isaac in particular. We started the first week that we did the binding of Isaac, we asked this question. If God knows the future and therefore already knows the outcome, why the need for the test? If God already knew that Abraham would be willing to bring Isaac as an offering and hold nothing back, why put Abraham and Isaac through this ordeal? What was to be gained if you already knew in advance that they would do it? And there are numerous answers that we could present to this fundamental question. I'm going to give you four answers found from different commentaries, different opinions. Number one, reward is given for action. You get reward for something you do, for deed. You're not rewarded for potential. Only after Abraham and Isaac lived through the experience, actualized it, they utilized their free choice, can they now be rewarded for their brave deed. According to this opinion, it's for the benefit of the one that's being tested that God tests an individual. It is Abraham that stands to benefit most from the test. And when I say Abraham, I'm referring to his descendants. The reward for the binding of Isaac was passed on in this savings account that earns lots of interest, a high interest payment on the savings account that every one of Abraham and Isaac's descendants benefit from. So we're all born with a piece of this inheritance of this savings account that earns interest in every generation as a reward for Abraham and Isaac passing the test of the binding of Isaac. That can only be if they actualized it. And so we are forever rewarded for the binding of Isaac. Ki borech avarechecha, God says, bless I will bless. Ekev asher shama bikoli, because you listen to my voice. So there will be blessings, continuous blessings, eternal blessings to the descendants of Abraham, because Abraham followed through on passing this test. Maimonides takes a different approach. Maimonides explains that the main purpose of the binding of Isaac was for all the nations of the world to become aware of Abraham's greatness. he explains the word yodaiti. Remember I said that God says, now I know, as now I have informed. Now I have informed the world as to why I selected Abraham. Now they know how great this man was. Otherwise they would ask, why was he chosen? Why was his descendants chosen? And that's the word nes, this banner, as we call the word for nisayon, the test, this banner that's put up for the world to explain to the world, this is the reason why God picked Abraham. The third opinion that I'll present to you comes from Abarbanel. I quoted him before. And he says it was not as much for the world to know about the greatness of Abraham, but it was for the Jewish people to know. It was for us to know, so that we know who our grandfather was, so that we know the strength of his amunah, of his faith, so that we know what it means to walk in the ways of God, so that we know why we are the chosen people. And finally, I present the Chassam Sofer's opinion, and he explains that the Jewish people throughout history would need this strength and would need this ability to perform acts of Mesirat Nefesh. They're going to need to have within them the ability to give everything up, even when it means the giving up of life. Not that we want to give up life, we want to live. Everything about Judaism points to life, to utilizing every moment of life for the purpose and the mission that we were given on this world. But we also understand, and the Chassam Sofer says, history was destined that the Jewish people, because of their mission as the chosen people, and because it's going to be a difficult mission, and because nations are not going to want to hear the mission of the Jewish people to bring goodness and morals and ethics to the world, that there will be kings and leaders and dictators that will oppose those teachings. And therefore there will be times, dark times of history. And the Jewish people will need to have within them the faith to withstand what will be thrown their way and to survive what will come their way. And that strength, that courage, that conviction that's within us, that came from Abraham. That came from the story of the binding of Isaac. So the binding of Isaac has within it the seeds of the ability to give it all for God that Jews have needed and have demonstrated throughout the thousands of years of our history. It's written in the portion of the Chukosai. God says an interesting thing over there. He talks about his love again for the patriarchs. He mentions it quite a few times in the Torah. And then he says the following, and I'll say it first in Hebrew and I translate it, but more importantly is for you to understand the point of the verse and what is pointed out from the verse. He says, V'zacharti es berisi Yaakov. The portion of the Chukosai is dealing with the difficult times of history. It's prophecy about what's going to happen with the Jewish people throughout history. And it talks about our great and glory days, but it also talks about days of difficulty, days of struggle, days of persecution, days of oppression, days of exile from your land, inquisitions, expulsions. So tough words. But then God promises that there'll be the great return. It's literally the prophecies of the Torah talk about this great return. That even after thousands of years of darkness, thousands of years of exiles, the Jewish people will hold on to God, and God will hold on to the Jewish people. The covenant will never end. The covenant will never be cut off. There will not be a need for a New Testament because the Old Testament will always be. There will only be that one testament, that one connection of God and the chosen people to bring light to all the nations on the face of the earth. And so he says in this verse, V'zacharti, I will remember, as berisi Yaakov. I'm going to remember the covenant I made with Jacob. Ve'es berisi Yitzchak, and the covenant I made with Isaac. Ve'es berisi Avraham esker, and the covenant I made with Abraham, I will remember. So if you just go quickly through that verse, God is saying, I had this close relationship with the three patriarchs. That relationship remains, that covenant remains, and because of that, I will always have this relationship with their descendants, and there will be that great reunion. And the Jewish people will be back in Israel, and the Jewish people will be back to being loved by the world and recognized by the world as God's people. If you, though, look into the verse very closely, you will see the following. That word zechira, that word to remember, is found in connection to the name Jacob and to the name Abraham. But God does not use the word to remember when he says Isaac's name. Again, the verse reads, I will remember the covenant with Jacob. So there you have Jacob's name and the word remember. And then the verse says, and the covenant with Isaac, but that word remember is not there. And the covenant with Abraham, I will remember. Remember with Jacob, remember with Abraham. No remember when it comes to Isaac, just about the covenant of Isaac. And so the question is asked, why in this verse does God use the term remember when it comes to Jacob? Why does he use the term remember when it comes to Abraham? But he doesn't use the term remember when he says Isaac's name. And the Talmud asks this question. And the Talmud says as follows. Because the ashes of Isaac are before God at all times. The ashes of Isaac from the altar of the binding of Isaac stay before God at all times. You do not use the term remember when something is right in front of you. You use the term remember when something once upon a time happened. But when it's right in front of you, you don't use the term remember. So about Jacob, he's going to remember. About Abraham, he's going to remember. Isaac, he doesn't have to remember because Isaac's ashes sit before God at all times. That's how precious the story of the binding of Isaac was, that he kept Isaac's ashes right in front of him. What's the problem with this answer? What kind of ashes of Isaac? He didn't go through with it. He was never actually slaughtered and brought up as an offering. He died like every other human being died, and he was buried. And he was buried in the cave of Machpelah, just like Abraham, just like Jacob. You could visit his burial site today in Hebron as soon as they lift the ban of travel. And Israel is holding pretty close ahead of the rest of the world. And you'll fly to Israel. You'll visit the homeland. You'll go to Hebron, the cities of the patriarchs. You'll go to the burial site of the patriarchs and matriarchs in Hebron, and you will visit the burial sites of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there are no ashes of Isaac because he was never brought as an offering. It was a test, but God stopped him and said, don't do it. Don't even harm him. Not even a little cut, nothing. And here the Talmud says, why do we have this verse that God remembers Jacob and God remembers Abraham, but it doesn't use the term remember by Isaac? And the Talmud says, oh, I know why. Because you don't use the term remember when something is right in front of you, and his ashes are right in front of God at all times. Similarly, there's another section of the Talmud talking about when they built the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. How did they know where to put the altar, the Mizbeach? How did they know where to place it in the Beit HaMikdash in the Holy Temple? And the Talmud answers, Rabbi Isaac Nafcha said, they put the altar exactly where the ashes of Isaac were laying. Again, the story of the binding of Isaac takes place on the Temple Mount. When God says to Abraham, go to the mountain that I will show you, he's going to Jerusalem. He's going to the Temple Mount. So where was the altar placed? exactly where the ashes of Isaac were. And again, we have exactly the same question. There were no ashes of Isaac. What ashes? And the answer is that the offering of the ram that Abraham brings after God stops him, and he sees a ram in the bushes and he brings the ram in the place of his son, was considered as if it was really Isaac, as if he was slaughtered, as if he was burned, as if he was turned to ashes. And it is those ashes that mark the location that would later serve as the place of the altar in the Holy Temple. What did the altar represent? The altar represented the bringing of forgiveness to the Jewish people. The altar represented the connection between us and God. The site of the altar is the site where those ashes of the ram, which took the place of Isaac, were. That's how precious the story of the binding of Isaac, that every single day we benefit from it. And it is those ashes that God puts before him at all times. What does that mean, he puts before it at all times? That God at all times, when he's looking at us, is wearing these lenses. He's watching down upon us. But right in front of those lenses are the ashes, meaning the story of the binding of Isaac sits before God at all times. And when he looks down upon Abraham's children and Isaac's children, and he looks down upon us, he will always remember the story of who we are, who we came from, what our Zaydis and Bubbies did to pave the way for us, to give us the strength, to give us the courage, to give us the emunah, to give us the betachon, the faith, and the trust in God. And so if you ever wonder, how is it that we have this conviction? And, when it comes to Mesirat Nefesh, when it comes to self-sacrifice, it wasn't only the great ones that had it. It wasn't only the holy ones that had it. It was the individual, simple Jew that had it. The stories throughout history of those standing up for their faith, whether they were standing up to the Nazis, they were standing up to the communists, standing up to any regime, the Babylonians, the Romans. Think about the Jews that were on top of Masada. They weren't holy individuals. They were the simple ones. But they also understood life has tremendous value. But at the same time, if life is stripped of its spirituality, of its holiness, of our ability to express our faith in God, then the statement that we make through Mesiras Nefesh is far more powerful than life itself. That strength we got from Abraham. Today's era, today's period of time, Baruch Hashem, thank God, we no longer have the challenge of having to give up our lives for God. Today, more than ever before, since the days of the Holy Temple, there is not a region anywhere in the world where Jews are not free to practice their faith. We couldn't say that 40 years ago, right? I mean, you had the Soviet Union, you had 6 million Jews that did not have their freedom there. You had millions of Jews throughout the world that did not have freedom. Today, Baruch Hashem, we live in a period of time that every single Jew has the ability to connect to God. So what's the Mesirat Nefesh of our generation? It's closer to the actual word, the self-sacrifice, the giving up of self, the giving up of what we desire for what God's desire. Our challenge, the challenge of today, is to look into Torah and to see the relevance of Torah for our generation, and to know that when God gives a commandment in the Torah, although given thousands of years ago at Sinai, God is speaking individually to each and every single one of us, to each and every single one of you. And God is asking you today, give up some of your comfort, give up perhaps some of your desire. Take a mitzvah of the Torah, take it upon yourself, incorporate it into your lives, incorporate it into your family lives. That's the Mesiras Nefesh of today. And when we do this today, in the freedom in which we live, indeed God will see it. He'll connect it to the ashes of Isaac of thousands of years ago, and he will bless us, our families, the Jewish people, Eretz Yisrael, and the entire world with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, which should happen speedily in our days. I want to wish all of you a very happy and kosher Passover. If you have any Passover, whether it's questions or needs, please don't hesitate to let us know. If you're not sure how to conduct a Seder and you need help with that, don't hesitate to let us know. As well, if there's anyone listening that does not have the funds to make a Seder, to purchase the food that you need for a Passover Seder, or you know of those that don't have the funds for a Seder, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. It will remain confidential, but we will see to it that you have what you need so that every single Jew can participate in the Passover Seder. If you're on the other side of the coin and you're blessed with the ability to help this campaign, you can simply go to chabadconejo.com/Passover. There'll be a link there so that you can give me the ability to reach out to as many people as possible, to put food on the table, to put Passover food on the table, to put matzah and wine and meat and fish, whatever it's going to take to make sure that every single Jew in our community has a beautiful Passover, celebrates the holiday of Passover, and indeed we should see L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, that indeed next year in Jerusalem, beyond Corona, without Corona, that all of us should be able to celebrate Mashiach's arrival and all of us journeying to Yerushalayim with the Holy Temple on the Temple Mount. A good Shabbos for this week Shabbos. You can join me Wednesday for the last class on the Wednesday afternoon class before the Passover break, Friday for our weekly sermon, and then we'll be back with biblical reflections 1 week after Passover. I'll be sending out the emails letting you know when we're starting up again. Take care, everyone.